The year is 1987, and you are a Japanese game designer named Hironobu Sakaguchi. I'm pretty sure that one, if not both of those points don't actually apply, but stick with me, I'm setting up a scene. So, you work for a dying video game company named Square, and the stakes are pretty high. You have one more shot at creating a best-selling hit video game. Otherwise, you'll be taking your sorry butt back to university and starting afresh. And not just any old video game, you'll be creating a fantasy game, heavily inspired by Dungeons & Dragons and directly competing against the mind-blowing success of Chunsoft's Dragon Warrior. Yeah, easy stuff, no pressure. But what will you name this fantasy adventure? Well, that's easy. Fighting Fantasy! Oh, wait, no. That name was taken by a series of role-playing books. Final Fantasy? Yeah, that seems right. There's a title that won't become painfully ironic in the future. Since its release, the original Final Fantasy has been ported to a multitude of platforms, sometimes with graphical and gameplay improvements. These platforms include the original PlayStation, Game Boy Advance, PSP, and most Apple or Android devices, just to name a few. If you want to play Final Fantasy yourself, go buy the most recent version. It'll provide you with several hours of fun, all while ironing out a lot of the kinks present in the original NES game. When you start the game, the first thing you'll need to do is create a party of 4, the Light Warriors. You pick their names and you pick their classes. Compared to later Final Fantasy games, which often boast distinct, memorable characters with set roles, it almost feels strange having the freedom of blank slate protagonists. It's refreshing, to say the least. As for the classes themselves, well, they're pretty basic. 3 physical classes, Fighter, Thief and Monk, and 3 magical classes, the Black, White and Red Mages. Warriors are beefy tanks who can dish out a lot of damage, but are expensive to equip. Thieves are kind of useless in my honest opinion, because their power is middling at best and they can't even steal items. Monks are super tough and easy to use, but take a lot of grinding to match a warrior's outputs. The monochrome mages are fragile, but can use a variety of spells and magical items to the player's advantage. And last of all, the red mage is a jack of all trades, a prodigy who can fulfill almost any physical or magical role, in a very mediocre fashion. So, with all that in mind, your choice of classes have a big impact on the game as a whole. God help you if you focus on all-out attacking without any healers, or even worse, vice versa. Classes can't be changed once the game begins, but they can all be upgraded halfway through the game by a Dragon King named Bahamut, allowing every class access to higher stats, if not more spells. Anyways, once you've assembled your gang, the first thing Final Fantasy does is spawn you outside the town and castle of Corneria. Cornelia. Oh god, I always confuse those two. Immediately setting your quest in motion, and already presenting you with some of the best music tracks in pretty much any video game. Even with the NES's audio limitations, the compositions of Nobu Uematsu are pretty boss. So, in no particular order, you kit up your team with spells, equipment and armour, and then meet up with King Cornelia, who informs you that his daughter has been kidnapped by a rogue knight named Garland. A few random encounters with imps and wolves later, you take on Garland, who, depending on which version of the game you're playing, may or may not threaten to knock you all down.
I, Garland, will knock you all down!
Ha! Memes! Several stabs, punches and fireballs later, The princess is saved and Garland is out of commission. At this point, the king has a huge bridge built for your team to carry on their prophesized journey, to travel by land, sea and sky, defeating 4 world-blighting elemental fiends and restoring 4 elemental crystals guarded by them, all in a bid to save the world from gradually decaying. That is, if you aren't punked by some random monster in the woods on the way there. This brings me to the battle system. The NES Final Fantasy games all had turn-based battle systems, something you wouldn't see used again by a mainstream Final Fantasy title until Final Fantasy X. For the time, this was a clever and simple way of controlling a full party of characters, in a fashion similar to D&D. All moves are chosen, the fastest characters or enemies attack first, damage is dealt by everybody, bish bash bosh, easy. But there's a serious flaw with this system. A flaw that is quite common with old NES RPGs, and a flaw that can't be dismissed as a feature because it was fixed in later installments. Here's a scenario. There are 2 particularly rowdy imps talking trash, basically asking for a beatdown. They seem pretty tough, but your team of 4 should have enough combined manpower to defeat both of them in a single turn. So you mash the A or X button, ordering all 4 of your party members to attack the imps. In later versions of the game, your party will beat down the first imp, then turn towards the second one and do the same. You know, following basic common sense. But in the NES version, your characters will attack and defeat the first imp, then proceed to swing wildly at the air where said imp used to be standing, giving his buddy a free hit and wasting the player's time. This makes no sense, none at all. Another problem with Final Fantasy's battle system on the NES, well, outside of how slow it is how it handles spellcasting. Again, re-releases have a simple, easy to understand MP system that allows your mages to use all manner of helpful spells fairly frequently. But the original sticks a little too close to the D&D system of allowing X amount of spells per day, with the value of X being incredibly stingy. This system is way too restrictive, and it renders the mages useless until you can find an infinite use magical item for them to spam. The power of their spells doesn't warrant such a strict limitation, especially considering that a lot of the spells don't work. For real, a lot of the spells in the original NES version of Final Fantasy don't even work, they are bugged. It quite literally ruins the magic. The point I'm making right now is, don't play the NES version of Final Fantasy for nostalgia's sake, it barely holds up. I'd much rather you play a balanced, polished port. With bonus content, there's basically no downside. Really now, if you like RPGs and somehow haven't already played Final Fantasy, go do it. Like, right now. With the kinks all ironed out, it is a bunch of fun. And I'm about to spoil the ending in 3, 2, 1. Turns out Garland was the mastermind behind the arrival of the Fiends and the decay of the planets. How he did this, despite his loss at the beginning of the game, is very simple. Time travel. The end of the game has you travel back in time to face Garland in his ultimate form, as a godlike demon named Chaos, who wants nothing more than to create an infinite time loop and repeatedly kill you forever. Harsh, man. When you finally do beat him though, you essentially reset the events of the game, preventing them from ever happening. Or at least, that's how I interpret it. Time travel is confusing. Either way, the story ends conclusively, not leaving any groundwork for a sequel, which is probably the reason that the Final Fantasy games are mainly self-contained stories that take place in their own universes. I guess we have this temporal shark jump to thank for that. So Final Fantasy was a roaring success and pioneered one of the biggest, most successful gaming franchises of all time. Despite noted flaws from its original release, I still have a fondness for the game as a whole, as do many others. Final Fantasy II sucks, and I hate it. Do excuse my startling change of tone, but I think Final Fantasy II is a train wreck, regardless of the version you play. It's not something that can be fixed with a few tweaks, it is fundamentally broken and unfun. Sorry to anybody who likes this game and nothing against you personally, but wow, it doesn't sit well with me. Before I talk you through the pros and the multitude of cons of FF2, let's take a look at the game as a whole. Originally released as a Japan exclusive, Final Fantasy II, or Final Fantasy Dark Shadow over Palakia, to use the prototype name, was the first Final Fantasy game with a story-driven plot and set characters. You can change their names, but by default, they are named Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon. As soon as the game starts, you are immediately plunged into a battle with some Imperial soldiers, which, I will admit, is a great way of establishing this game's relatively dark and oppressive tone. In fact, the battle isn't even winnable, and leaves you down a party member. Leon is absent for the vast majority of the game, much to your party's distress. Once you're back on your feet though, you team up with a rebel alliance led by a dethroned princess, and you work together to take down the Empire. Yes, the plot is basically Star Wars, with the major difference being that Emperor Palpatine, or Matthias as he is called here, has a strong resemblance to the late David Bowie.
You remind me of the Babe. Babe with the power.
Anyways, how can a game with such an engaging setup be that bad? Well, let's get the pros out of the way first, then let's get critical. Number 1. The music. While ultimately not a touch on the first game, Final Fantasy II has some decent tracks, with my two favourites being the Rebels theme and the battle theme. Number 2. Innovation. This game took some bold steps to distance itself from the original, from the darker tone all the way to the revamped gameplay. Considering how many franchises are happy to repeat content and stagnate, I find this really admirable. Even considering that almost all of the changes suck. Number 3. Wow, I actually can't think of another pro. There are chocobos in this game. Cute birds that you can ride around like horses. Time for cons. Number 1. Characters. So, as I said earlier, you're stuck with 3 party members, and given the aforementioned Star Wars influence, I'm sure you can guess what happens with Leon. So, what does this game do to account for the empty slot? Well, as the story goes on, that space is filled by 5 different party members: Minwu, Joseph, Gordon, Leela, and Ricard. 4 characters who exist for the sole purpose of stealing potential experience from your mainstays, and then either buggering off or dying in decreasingly dramatic heroic sacrifices. Don't get me wrong, the permanent death of a party member can have a strong impact in a JRPG, but in this case, it actually makes the game more of a chore to play. With every new addition to the party, you as a player are left wondering, should I even bother? Or are you fated to be cannon fodder? Number 2. Dialogue. This game introduces a never again seen dialogue mechanic, in an ill-advised attempt to flesh out the world. It is transparent, pointless, and it can even lead to impeding your progress. In summary, you learn keywords and have to regurgitate them to the right key characters at the right time. Again, utterly pointless. Number 3, Overworld. This is what initially tipped me off to the fact that I wouldn't be enjoying FF2. When you first enter the overworld, you'll notice that it's no longer restrictive like it was in the first game. Instead of small continents that open up to you as you grow stronger and find more vehicles, you get a huge continent to explore. But in an attempt to do exactly that, you'll encounter enemies from the end game. Instant game over. At which point, you realise that you have been lied to. You are forced to follow strict directions. Number 4, Dungeons. What is with this game's encounter rates? I swear it is higher than in any other Final Fantasy. You can barely move without being accosted by soldiers or monsters. And Dungeons will actually capitalise on this, with their dead ends, and even worse, their fake doors. Doors that leave you smack dab in the middle of empty rooms, where the encounter rate is absurdly high, making them a nightmare to escape from. This is straight up sadistic. Number 5, Magic. So, for the most part, battles themselves are just like those from the first game, but that includes the whole broken spellcasting issue in the NES versions. Final Fantasy II takes that a step further though, with its biggest crime coming in the form of Ultima. Within the game's lore, Ultima is a terrifyingly destructive spell that uses all of its users' magical proficiency to mercilessly obliterate any target. It is acquired through heroic sacrifice to be used against the mighty Emperor. And in the NES version of FF2, it is bugged. It can only deal a measly 500 points of damage at its absolute best. Ultima. The spell synonymous with overkill in later Final Fantasy games was a wet fart in its debut appearance. And number 6, the leveling system. This is the worst thing about FF2. The most tragic aspect of the leveling system is that I get it. I get where the developers were coming from when they implemented this. It sounds great on paper, but what they ended up creating was useless, broken, and somehow exploitable at the same time. EXP and levels, gone. They took the word experience literally. Every character, all of whom are capable of equipping any item or learning any spell, only get good at doing so by practicing. So for a character to effectively wield a sword, they need to start hacking at enemies with a sword. To master spells, they need to repeatedly cast them. So far, so good, this is fine. The problem, the glaring problem, lies in the defensive stats. To raise your defense, and I can't believe I'm saying this, you have to take damage. And to raise your maximum HP, you need to end battles with low health. If you, understandably, breeze through the early enemies, you will hit a nigh impenetrable wall, where bog-standard encounters will casually destroy you. So what do? You turn to the daftest and most tedious exploit possible, and you repeatedly punch yourself in the face. You have the party kick their own teeth in until they're barely alive anymore. Your defensive stats will quickly skyrocket. Introducing a new problem. The game has gone from being way too hard to being trivially easy. You aren't being fairly challenged, and even worse, you aren't having fun. With all of that covered, Do I recommend Final Fantasy II? What kind of question is that? Of course I don't. This game is a steaming pile of garbage. And there are far better games out there that make use of the learn by doing gimmick. I hear that the Saga games are good for that, so I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, try those instead. They are probably way better. If I haven't swayed you, here's a spoiler warning for the end of FF2. 3, 2, 1. You kill the Emperor after fighting him inside a giant magical tornado. The war is over, and the world seems to be at peace once again. Until powerful monsters spawn from the pits of hell, yes, actual hell, start swarming the world. In a twist that is so cool, I may have to throw it onto the now overshadowed list of pros. The Emperor turns out to be such a tyrant that he dethrones Satan and conquers hell. And if you play the bonus content from the GBA port onwards, he conquers heaven too. So teaming up with a reformed Leon, you have to kill him again, completely erasing his soul. Oh, and before we move on, awesome final boss theme. So, ending with a positive note for FF2, let's move on. Final Fantasy III. A game that even today holds up as being fun, creative, and sufficiently challenging. Most of us Westerners got our first taste of this game through the DS ports, which boasted some very cute 3D graphics and 4 fleshed out protags: Lunith, Ark, Refia, and Ingus. But the original NES game, which was yet another Japan exclusive, was quite a different story. Harkening back to the first game, your characters were 4 relatively blank slates known as the Onion Knights, whose names and classes were decided by the player. Another way this game calls back to the original is through its similar story. 4 warriors of light, albeit younger this time around, go on a quest to restore balance to the world by way of magical crystals. The story is simple and the tone is whimsical. Well, until you get to the end where things start to get bleak, but more on that soon. So what is the defining feature that makes FF3 stand out? Well, it's quite simple in its brilliance. This is the first Final Fantasy game to incorporate a job system. Characters are no longer locked to a single job or a single role in battle. Anytime you find one of the game's 4 magical crystals, your characters are bestowed with a whole new set of jobs. Jobs that they can swap into from the menu. There are transitional periods of lowered stats between job changes to stop things getting too easy, of course, but otherwise the freedom to mold your characters is far more fun to play with than anything offered by the previous 2 games. And aside from the blank slates, there are 21 jobs to choose from, all with unique abilities. 21! As opposed to the original game's 6. I can't even hope to cover them all in depth without boring the pants off of you, so here are a bunch of heavily condensed summaries. Warriors, thieves, monks, and mages. Been there, done that, same as the originals, but on the bright side, at least the thieves can actually steal now. Knights. Defensive tanks who can guard and heal allies to keep the party from dying. I rely on these guys quite a lot more than I probably should. Rangers. Archery buffs who can attack from afar, which protects them from physical attacks and allows them to dish out damage with a barrage of arrows. Scholars. Nerdy mages who can deal more damage or restore more health when using items, and can scan opponents for their elemental weaknesses. Geomancers. Elemental fighters. Think of the elemental benders from the Avatar series and you pretty much have the right idea. Dragoons. Weird dragon enthusiasts who excel on jumping on people's heads with spears. Just like dragons. Vikings. Walking murder machines who kill real goods. Dark Knights. Bards. Musicians who can buff the party or debilitate enemies with their sick harp tunes. Evokers. Dudes who can summon monsters to deal decent damage or support the party. Black belts. Kung Fu masters who can power up and punch enemies to smithereens. Devouts. Slower but more potent white mages. Maguses. Same as before, but for black mages. Summoners. Dudes who can draw out monsters' full potential and have them nuke enemies. Ninjas. Masters of Shadow who... What do you want from me? It's a ninja. Look at it, it's a ninja. How can you not want a ninja? And sages, which I like to think is a shortening of super mages. They can magic real good, but it takes them ages to do anything. So with all those classes for the player to swap between, the enemies of FF3 will need to be pretty tough in order to present a challenge. This takes us neatly onto the next point. The fact that enemies in this game are really tough. Some bosses or predetermined encounters in this game are just plain sadistic if you don't address them correctly. With the three biggest offenders being a Garuda, who can electrocute the entire party unless you all jump on his head with dragoons, a tyrant named Hein, whose elemental weakness changes over time, essentially requiring a scholar to analyze him, or, well, the entire final dungeon, which amounts to being a marathon of overpowered boss fights without a moment's reprieve. So, taking this all in mind, what are my thoughts on FF3? Well, it is by far the best of the original Final Fantasy trilogy, boasting a wealth of content and a grand adventure that spans over 2 different worlds. But it is certainly not for the faint of heart or for inexperienced RPG players. In other words, no casuals allowed up in this biz. But for real, I would highly recommend grabbing a copy of Final Fantasy III. It's a pretty decent installment that paves the way for a lot of future Final Fantasy games. Its ending, while tough as nails, is also quite interesting, so spoiling in 3, 2, 1. Unlike the first 2 games where you face off in climactic battles against very human enemies, Final Fantasy III's necrophobic villain, Xande, who uses darkness to freeze the world in time and live forever, turns out to have been nothing more than a puppet for the real final boss. An oddly sexualized and incomprehensible evil named the Cloud of Darkness. What? No, that's not even close to who I meant. I said oddly sexualized. Cloud of Darkness, like most of FF3, is brilliant in her simplicity. She wants to kill everything, send it all into the void. Obviously, we can't be having that, so the final battle ensues. And hey, you know how I've basically neglected discussing the music of Final Fantasy III, despite the fact that it's all quite fun to listen to and well composed? Well, that is because the Cloud of Darkness's boss theme blows it all out of the water, being my favourite music track in the entire original trilogy. This track instills a real sense of fear and suspense into a legitimately hard battle. A battle that will decide the fate of the world. And the last hour or so of your life, considering the lack of any save points. So with COD defeated, the worlds as you've come to know and love them are saved. You've beaten what may be the hardest Final Fantasy game, and you deserve a well-earned rest. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. As an experimental new project, I've been tinkering with the format of vidgams quite a lot, but I feel like scripted analyses or overviews like this one fit quite nicely, so let me know how you feel in the comments. Anyways, thanks a ton, and I'll see you all later.